Imagine a quiet room. No dramatic lighting, no grand introduction. Just two men sitting across from each other. Not as literary giants, not as historical figures, just as two minds that couldn't stop asking questions. Dostoevsky would probably begin with guilt. He would ask why we feel it so deeply after doing something wrong. Why a single moral mistake can echo in the chest for days. And Kafka would gently interrupt. What about the guilt that appears even when you've done nothing wrong? What about the feeling of being accused without knowing the crime? Dostoevsky believed suffering must mean something, that pain refines, that it purifies, that it leads somewhere. Kafka wasn't so sure. He would ask whether suffering sometimes just happens, without lesson, without redemption, without explanation. Dostoevsky feared a world without God, because without God, what stops a man from doing evil? Kafka feared something else. He feared a world where God is gone, but the system remains. Where judgment exists, but no one can tell you who is judging. Dostoevsky thought guilt came from within, from conscience, from the soul. Kafka thought judgment came from everywhere, from offices, from institutions, from invisible structures. To Dostoevsky, suffering was a path upward. To Kafka, suffering was a corridor with no exit. And that's why they still feel alive today. Because when you lie awake at night, you might not know whether the anxiety you feel is moral or structural, whether you're afraid of being wrong or being processed. One believed without meaning, everything collapses. The other believed without meaning, everything continues. If you've ever felt guilty, or powerless, or judged without knowing why, you've already stood between them. Tonight we let them speak. Sit back, my friend. You're listening to Wise Alchemy. Before they became names in literature, before they became symbols of guilt and absurdity, they were simply men living inside pressures they did not choose. And those pressures shaped the way they understood fear. Dostoevsky's life divided itself into a before and an after. In 1849, he was arrested for participating in a discussion group considered politically dangerous. It was not terrorism, it was conversation. But in Tsarist Russia, conversation could be fatal. He was sentenced to death. On a freezing morning, he and other prisoners were taken to a public square. They were lined up, white shirts placed over their clothes. The final rites were read. He believed he had minutes left to live. Imagine that. The mind counting its final thoughts, the body bracing for impact. And then, a messenger arrived. The execution was commuted. A performance of mercy. A calculated psychological torment. Instead of death, he was sent to Siberian labor camp. 4 years among murderers and thieves, chains on his legs, wooden barracks, brutal cold. He watched men break. He watched men endure. He watched guilt eat people alive, and something shifted in him. He had flirted with radical politics before prison. After prison, he turned inward, toward faith, toward the moral weight of action, toward the idea that suffering reveals something essential. To him, pain was not random. It exposed pride. It exposed delusion. It exposed the dangerous idea that a human could stand above moral law. His near-death experience convinced him that life is fragile, and therefore morally serious. This is why his characters tremble, why they confess, Why guilt in his novels feels alive, suffocating, undeniable. Because he had stood at the edge of extinction. He believed suffering was a confrontation with truth. Kafka's life was different. No firing squad, no prison camp, no grand rupture. He worked in an insurance office. Every day he processed paperwork for workplace injuries, accidents, claims, procedures. He saw how systems categorize human suffering. A crushed hand became a file number. A broken spine became documentation. Not evil, not dramatic, just administrative. Kafka lived in Prague under the Austro-Hungarian Empire, a layered, bureaucratic society where authority existed at many levels and rarely explained itself. He was a German-speaking Jew in a Czech-majority city, not fully belonging anywhere. At home, his father was dominant, loud, imposing. He felt small in his presence. He later wrote a long letter to him, never delivered, describing the feeling of being judged without understanding the rules. Kafka did not experience one traumatic event that fractured his worldview. Instead, he experienced something subtler, the quiet pressure of structure, forms to fill out, rules that exist but are unclear, offices you enter but never fully understand. His anxiety did not come from the edge of death. It came from the feeling that something invisible was evaluating him, that doors existed but access was uncertain, that authority was present but faceless. Kafka did not write about criminals tormented by conscience. He wrote about ordinary men caught in systems that never explain themselves. Joseph K. is arrested without being told the charge. K seeks entry into a castle that never grants audience. This isn't moral drama, it's procedural opacity. This is where the two men diverge. Dostoevsky was shaped by rupture. Kafka was shaped by routine. Dostoevsky believed that when everything is stripped away, the soul stands exposed before God. Kafka believed that even when nothing dramatic happens, you can still feel judged by systems, by institutions, by invisible structures. One experienced the terror of a rifle aimed at his chest. The other experienced the slow suffocation of being processed. From one came novels about confession and redemption. From the other came stories about accusation and delay. Both were responding to fear, but they were not the same fear. One feared the collapse of moral order. The other feared the quiet persistence of impersonal power. And from those different fears, two different nightmares were born. Writers do not invent their nightmares from nothing. They absorb them from the air around them. And the air in Dostoevsky Russia felt unstable. 19th century Russia was not calm, it was restless. The old Orthodox faith still stood, heavy, ancient, unquestioned by many. But beneath it, something was shifting. Young intellectuals were reading European philosophy. Atheism was spreading. Radical political movements were forming. Ideas were not academic, they were explosive. Socialism, nihilism, revolutionary theory. Students were debating whether morality was real, whether God was necessary, whether tradition should be dismantled. It was a country torn between mysticism and modernity, between sacred tradition and imported ideology. This wasn't quiet doubt, it was loud, public, dangerous. The state reacted harshly. Surveillance, censorship, arrests. Faith wasn't just private belief, it was part of national identity. To question God was to destabilize the structure of society. That is the atmosphere Dostoevsky lived in. A world where spiritual crisis was not abstract, it was national. It was political. It was urgent. The fear in Russia wasn't bureaucracy. It was collapse. Collapse of faith, collapse of morality, collapse of social order. And so Dostoevsky's novels wrestle with ideological chaos. Characters who believe they are beyond good and evil. Young men who test whether murder can be justified by theory. His anxiety was moral and revolutionary. What happens when a society loses its spiritual foundation? That was the Russian question. Kafka's Prague felt different, less explosive, more organized. Prague sat inside the Austro-Hungarian Empire, a vast, multilingual, bureaucratic machine. Authority here wasn't ideological, it was administrative. Rules existed, offices existed, hierarchies existed. You might not like them, but they functioned. The empire did not collapse in loud philosophical debate, it expanded in paperwork, forms, regulations, permits. Kafka lived inside a society that was modernizing rapidly. Railways, industry, insurance, labor law. Institutions were multiplying. Human life increasingly passed through offices. Identity became documented, approved, stamped. Kafka, as a German-speaking Jew in a Czech-majority city under Austrian rule, inhabited multiple layers of distance at once. Not fully Austrian, not fully Czech, not fully belonging. His world wasn't ideologically chaotic, it was quietly impersonal. No one was debating God in the streets, but people were navigating systems they didn't fully understand. Power didn't shout, it processed. That is the difference. Dostoevsky wrote in a society arguing about ultimate truth. Kafka wrote in a society already operating without needing ultimate answers. Russia feared moral revolution. Prague embodied administrative order. One atmosphere felt like spiritual fire. The other felt like fluorescent lighting. Ideological chaos versus administrative order. And each writer absorbed the texture of his time. From Russia came novels about rebellion, confession, faith. From Prague came stories about forms, files, and faceless authority. Different climates, different anxieties, different nightmares forming in the background. If you remove history, biography, and politics, what you're left with are two different fears about being human. Dostoevsky's nightmare begins inside the individual. It begins with freedom. His characters are not victims of accident. They are thinkers. They are arguers. They are people who test limits. Raskolnikov does not kill in blind rage. He kills with a theory behind him. He wants to know whether morality is universal, or whether some men stand above it. This is important. For Dostoevsky, evil is not chaos. It is rationalized. It is justified. It begins with the idea that conscience can be silenced. And once the act is done, something inside collapses. Not society, not law, the self. His characters sweat, they pace, they hallucinate, they confess. Why? Because in Dostoevsky's world, guilt is not procedural, it is existential. It does not wait for a court, it does not need witnesses. Conscience becomes the courtroom. The accusation comes from within. And redemption is possible, but only through suffering. To him, pain is not meaningless. It is the cost of moral awareness. His nightmare is this. What happens when a man believes he can replace God with himself? What happens when ideology overrides humility? What happens when freedom detaches from responsibility? The fear is spiritual corruption, a soul unraveling under the weight of its own choices. Kafka's nightmare does not begin with choice. It begins with circumstance. His characters do not commit bold crimes. They are not testing morality. They are ordinary men living ordinary lives. And yet, something feels wrong. Joseph K. wakes up and is informed he is under arrest. Not imprisoned, just processed. The charge is never clarified. He tries to understand the rules. He tries to find the authority. He tries to locate the center of power. But there is no center. Only offices, rooms, clerks, procedures that continue whether he understands them or not. In Kafka's world, guilt precedes action. Authority exists before explanation, and innocence does not protect you. His fear is not that man will declare himself above morality. It is that man is already beneath something impersonal. Not tyrants screaming from balconies, but systems humming quietly. There is no dramatic villain, just endless administration. Kafka's anxiety is subtle but devastating. What if you are judged without knowing the rule? What if power does not need to justify itself? What if the process continues regardless of truth? In Dostoevsky, the soul fights itself. In Kafka, the individual fights opacity. One nightmare explodes from the inside, the other suffocates from the outside. Dostoevsky asks, can a man live after violating his conscience? Kafka asks, can a man live when the accusation never clarifies? Dostoevsky fears the human who denies moral law. Kafka fears the human trapped in a law he cannot see. One world trembles under spiritual rebellion. The other hums under bureaucratic inevitability. And this is why both still feel modern. Because some nights you feel like Raskolnikov, guilty, restless, arguing with your own conscience. And some nights you feel like Joseph K., confused, processed, unsure what you did to deserve the pressure. Corruption of the soul, or machinery without face. Two nightmares, both still alive. Raskolnikov does not kill in confusion. He kills with a theory. Before the murder, he writes an article arguing that humanity is divided into two kinds of people: the ordinary, who must obey moral law, and the extraordinary, who may transgress it if their actions serve a higher purpose. He admires Napoleon. He studies history. He convinces himself that greatness requires blood. The pawnbroker, in his mind, is not a person. She is an obstacle, a parasite, an expendable piece in a larger moral equation. This is crucial. He does not see himself as evil. He sees himself as testing a hypothesis. Can he step over the line? Can he endure what others cannot? Is he one of the extraordinary? The murder itself is brutal and clumsy. It is not heroic. It is not clean. It is chaotic. And in that chaos, something breaks. Not the world, him. Immediately after the act, nothing dramatic happens externally. There is no instant arrest, no mob, no divine lightning. The city continues. The streets are normal. The law does not immediately move. But internally, something has shifted beyond repair. His mind begins to fragment. He falls into fever. He swings between superiority and disgust. One moment he defends his logic. The next he recoils from it. He cannot reconcile the image of himself as extraordinary with the reality of blood on his hands. This is the punishment Dostoevsky cares about. Not prison, conscience. Raskolnikov begins to feel watched, not by police, but by his own awareness. He overinterprets glances. He fears casual conversations. He hears accusation in silence. The guilt is not procedural, it is existentially invasive. He wants to confess, not because he has been cornered, but because the psychological weight becomes unbearable. The longer he avoids confession, the more distorted he becomes. Isolation intensifies it. Pride intensifies it. Denial intensifies it. Dostoevsky makes a terrifying claim through him. You cannot intellectually override moral law without psychological consequence. Even if society fails to detect your crime, your inner structure detects it. Raskolnikov's collapse proves something in Dostoevsky's universe. Moral law is not merely social agreement, it is woven into the human condition. Guilt is not imposed. It emerges, it erupts, it corrodes from the inside. And redemption in this framework is not legal forgiveness, it is spiritual restoration. When Raskolnikov finally confesses, it is not defeat, it is surrender to reality. He accepts that he is not above moral law, that suffering must be endured, that humility must replace pride. In Dostoevsky's world, guilt is not meaningless pain. It is evidence of moral architecture. You can deny it. You can theorize against it. You can try to transcend it. But once you act against it, something inside you revolts. Even if no judge condemns you, your conscience does. This is moral guilt. Crime, collapse, confession. Not because the system forced it, because the soul could not survive without it. Joseph K. does not commit murder. He does not test moral law. He does not declare himself extraordinary. He wakes up. That's all. And on that morning, two men inform him that he is under arrest. Not violently, not dramatically, calmly, almost politely. He asks what he is accused of. They do not answer. He assumes there must be some mistake. There is always a reason, isn't there? A charge, a file, a clause, something. But in Kafka's world, the charge is never specified. The trial begins without explanation, and that is where the horror lies. Raskolnikov knew what he had done. Joseph K. does not. He searches for clarity. He visits courtrooms hidden inside apartment buildings. He speaks to minor officials. He tries to find the hierarchy. He assumes there must be a structure behind the structure. Someone in charge, someone who knows. But the deeper he goes, the more opaque it becomes. Offices lead to more offices. Rules exist, but access to them is partial. Authority is present, but never fully visible. The process continues, whether he understands it or not. This is the psychological shift. At first, there is confusion. Surely this will be resolved. Surely innocence matters. Surely logic applies. Then comes compliance. He attends hearings. He answers questions. He tries to cooperate. If he participates properly, perhaps the system will clarify itself. But clarity never comes. Only procedure. Only delay. Only vague references to higher authorities. Over time, confusion turns into exhaustion. Not rage, not rebellion, just weariness. He begins to internalize the accusation, not because he believes he committed a crime, but because the structure around him behaves as if he did. The process itself becomes the punishment, not imprisonment, not torture, but uncertainty. And that uncertainty reshapes him. He starts defending himself without knowing what he's defending against. He feels judged without knowing the law. He becomes smaller, more anxious, less certain of himself. This is existential guilt. Not guilt for what you have done, but guilt for being inside a system that assumes your accountability. In Kafka's world, guilt does not follow action, it precedes it. You are already implicated, already processed, already subject to rules you do not fully understand. The terror is not that you broke moral law, it is that moral law may not even be the point. Authority does not need your crime, it only needs your presence. Joseph K. spends the novel searching for explanation, but explanation is never delivered. And by the time the end arrives, he is no longer demanding clarity. He is tired, resigned. He participates in his own execution almost passively, not because he believes he deserves it, but because resistance feels pointless. In Dostoevsky, guilt erupts from conscience. In Kafka, guilt seeps in from structure. One collapses because he sinned. The other collapses because the system never clarified. This is the deeper fear Kafka introduces. Not, what have I done, but what am I already inside? And that question lingers long after the book closes. At the heart of both writers is the same word, guilt. But they disagree completely about where it comes from. In Dostoevsky, judgment begins inside you. The world may punish you, but it is secondary. The real fracture happens in the soul. When Raskolnikov commits murder, no one forces him to feel remorse. He tries not to. He argues against it. He intellectualizes it. But conscience does not negotiate. It rises uninvited. It disrupts sleep. It distorts perception. It splits the self into two, the one who acted and the one who watches the act in horror. In this universe, guilt creates psychological fracture. The mind cannot fully survive the lie it tells itself. And because guilt is internal, redemption is possible. Confession restores alignment, suffering purifies, humility heals the split. Judgment here is moral. You are guilty because you acted, and the line exists whether you admit it or not. Dostoevsky's terror is not that authority will accuse you. It is that your own conscience will. Kafka relocates the source entirely. In his world, judgment does not originate in the soul. It surrounds it. Joseph K. does not collapse because of an action. He collapses because the system treats him as though an action has occurred. Guilt is not discovered. It is assigned. There is no moment of moral fracture. There is only procedural implication. The process does not need confession. It does not seek repentance. It does not offer spiritual restoration. It simply continues. Judgment is external, impersonal, endless. In this universe, redemption is unclear, maybe impossible. You can comply. You can search for clarity. You can argue, but the system never reveals the full logic of your accusation. And without knowing the charge, how can you atone? Kafka's terror is not that you will violate moral law. It is that law may operate without transparency, that you are already implicated by virtue of existing within structure. Dostoevsky says, you are guilty because you acted. Kafka says, you are guilty because you exist. One imagines judgment emerging from conscience. The other imagines judgment descending from machinery. One believes moral order is built into the human condition. The other suggests order may not care about morality at all. And this is the deeper divide. In Dostoevsky, guilt proves the existence of moral law. In Kafka, guilt proves the existence of power. One nightmare asks, "Can I live with what I've done?" The other asks, "Can I live inside something I don't understand?" Moral guilt versus existential guilt. And between those two forms of judgment, modern anxiety still oscillates. Dostoevsky does not give you a comforting God. There are no glowing certainties in his novels, no easy sermons, no simple reward for belief. If anything, belief in his world is exhausting. God is rarely visible. He does not interrupt suffering. He does not prevent tragedy. Children suffer, innocents die, people betray one another. And still, the question of God refuses to disappear. That is what makes him central. In The Brothers Karamazov, Ivan does not gently doubt. He rebels. He gathers stories of tortured children and asks whether any future harmony could justify such pain. He does not say, "I don't believe." He says, "I return the ticket." He refuses a universe built on innocent suffering. And Dostoevsky does not silence him. He lets the argument stand in full force. That is important. Doubt is not censored in Dostoevsky. It is dramatized. Faith is not blind acceptance. It is confrontation. His characters argue with God because God matters. If God were irrelevant, there would be nothing to argue about. Even rebellion presupposes structure. Even anger presupposes expectation. Dostoevsky's world assumes that morality is not invented by society. It is discovered, painfully. When Raskolnikov collapses under guilt, it is not because social norms have conditioned him. It is because something deeper reacts. Conscience in Dostoevsky's universe is not a cultural artifact. It is evidence. Evidence that human beings are not morally neutral, that actions fracture something real. This is why suffering in his novels is not meaningless. It is terrible. It is humiliating, but it is not empty. Suffering strips illusions. It destroys pride. It exposes the lie that we can stand above good and evil. And in that exposure, there is the possibility, not the guarantee, of redemption. Redemption does not arrive automatically. It requires confession, humility, endurance, faith without proof. And that is the core of Dostoevsky's theology. God is hidden, but not absent. Silence is not indifference. It is the space in which freedom operates. If God were obvious, belief would not be choice. If moral law were enforced visibly, humility would not be voluntary. The struggle itself becomes the point. Faith exists precisely because certainty does not. And that is why Dostoevsky's universe feels morally charged. Every decision echoes. Every rebellion has consequence. Every act weighs something unseen. The silence of God deepens the tension. It does not dissolve it. For Dostoevsky, the world is not administratively neutral. It is morally structured, even when that structure hurts, even when it terrifies, even when it remains unseen. Kafka does not erase authority. It strips it of transcendence. In his world, power is not divine, it is procedural. There are offices, there are courtrooms, there are officials who seem to know something. There are hierarchies stacked on top of hierarchies. This is not chaos, it is organization. But something is missing. There is no final explanation, no ultimate voice, no revelation. In The Trial, Joseph K. is informed that he is under arrest, not violently, not dramatically, calmly. Life continues. He goes to work. He attends hearings. The machinery of the court begins to move around him. but the machinery never reveals its foundation. He assumes there must be clarity somewhere. Somewhere above these minor officials, someone must understand the whole structure. Somewhere there must be a definitive law. But every attempt to ascend leads only to another layer, another intermediary, another office, another waiting room. Authority exists, but it is inaccessible. It does not present itself for examination. It does not justify itself. It does not explain. And this is the crucial difference from divine mystery. In religious silence, there is the possibility that meaning is too large to grasp. In Kafka's silence, there is no promise of depth, only distance, only deferral. The system does not hide because it is sacred. It hides because it does not owe you clarity. That is far colder. Joseph K. spends the novel trying to convert procedure into meaning. He believes that if he follows the process correctly, if he complies carefully, if he reasons patiently, then eventually the logic will emerge. But logic never arrives. The process becomes self-sustaining. The trial is not about discovering truth, it is about maintaining structure. The hearings feel ritualistic. The officials feel half-informed. The rooms are cramped, suffocating, improvised. Nothing feels divine. Everything feels administrative. This is power without transcendence, authority without moral revelation. In Dostoevsky, silence invites struggle. In Kafka, silence produces fatigue. Joseph K. does not wrestle with God. He navigates paperwork. He searches for access. He waits. And slowly, the absence of explanation reshapes him. He begins to doubt not only the system, but himself. If the court insists on his guilt long enough, does innocence even matter? Not because he feels morally corrupt, but because he feels processed. Kafka introduces a terrifying possibility. What if the universe does not require moral justification to operate? What if systems function independently of good and evil? What if judgment is not a response to sin, but a feature of structure? Divine silence becomes bureaucratic silence, and bureaucratic silence is indifferent. It does not test your faith. It does not refine your soul. It does not offer redemption. It simply continues. Kafka's nightmare is not that God is hidden. It is that explanation itself may not exist. The world may run. Rules may apply. Consequences may unfold without any moral center behind them. In such a universe, the question is no longer, am I righteous? But, am I legible to the system? And that shift changes everything. Both Dostoevsky and Kafka construct worlds filled with silence. But silence is never neutral. It always implies something. The difference is what? In Dostoevsky, silence feels charged. When God does not answer, the absence feels heavy, almost unbearable. Characters cry out not into emptiness, but into what they believe must be listening. Ivan's rebellion only makes sense if moral structure exists. He does not shout into nothing. He protests to someone. Even refusal assumes presence. That's the paradox. The silence wounds because expectation exists. If there were nothing there, there would be nothing to rage against. But in Dostoevsky, doubt never cancels transcendence. It intensifies it. Hiddenness becomes part of the drama. Faith is not certainty. It is endurance without confirmation. And this hiddenness preserves freedom. If divine order were visible, obedience would be automatic. There would be no real choice, no moral weight, no meaningful rebellion. Silence allows for struggle, Struggle allows for responsibility, and responsibility gives action consequence. In this universe, suffering hurts, but it has orientation. Guilt burns, but it points somewhere. Even despair implies a standard. Meaning may be strained, meaning may be questioned, meaning may feel fragile, but it is not erased. The silence is sacred mystery, uncomfortable, demanding, but morally alive. Kafka's silence feels different from the first page. It is not heavy with transcendence. It is thin, flat, procedural. Joseph K. does not cry out to heaven. He waits in offices. He navigates hallways. He speaks to minor officials who defer upward endlessly. There is authority, but it does not feel sacred. It feels administrative. And the silence here does not protect freedom. It produces uncertainty. Not the kind that deepens faith, the kind that drains energy. In Kafka's world, silence does not test you. It ignores you. The system does not reveal its foundation because it does not need to. It continues regardless. There is no promise that suffering refines you, no assurance that endurance redeems you, no sign that justice exists behind the curtain. Explanation is permanently deferred. Meaning is neither confirmed nor denied. It is suspended. And suspension becomes exhausting. In Dostoevsky, silence pushes you toward confession. In Kafka, silence pushes you toward fatigue. One silence feels tragic. The other feels indifferent. And that distinction changes everything. Because if silence hides depth, then struggle matters. If silence hides nothing, then struggle may be procedural. One world suggests moral architecture beneath chaos. The other suggests systems that operate without moral center. In Dostoevsky, the soul is at risk. In Kafka, the individual is processed. And the question remains, unsettling, unresolved. Is silence sacred mystery, or is it structural indifference? Is the universe morally structured, even if painfully so? Or is it administratively indifferent, functioning without explanation? Between those two interpretations, modern anxiety still oscillates. And depending on which silence you believe in, you either wrestle with God or you navigate corridors. Morally structured mystery versus administratively indifferent order. For Dostoevsky, suffering is not a detour in life. It is the road. His characters do not stumble into pain as a subplot. They descend into it as necessity. And that descent is never meaningless. It is surgical. It cuts into pride. It dismantles illusion. It exposes the fragile scaffolding of self-justification. Take Raskolnikov again. Before the murder, he lives inside an idea. He divides humanity into categories. The ordinary must obey moral law. The extraordinary may transcend it. He believes himself capable of stepping over conscience, of enduring what weaker men cannot. The act of murder is brutal, but the real destruction comes afterward, not from the law, from inside. His mind fractures, not because society condemns him, but because his own internal architecture cannot support what he has done. He becomes feverish, paranoid, oscillating between grandiosity and self-loathing. This psychological collapse is not accidental. It is the beginning of awakening. His suffering exposes his lie. He is not extraordinary. He is human. And that realization is humiliating. Humiliation in Dostoevsky's world is not merely shame, it is purification. Pride isolates, suffering reconnects. The collapse breaks open the possibility of humility, and humility allows confession. Confession restores alignment between action and conscience, between ego and reality. That alignment is the first step towards spiritual rebirth. This is the pattern that repeats throughout Dostoevsky's work. Pain strips, stripping humbles, humbling opens the soul. Even the physical spaces of suffering carry symbolic weight. Prison in Siberia, not as annihilation, but as confrontation. Poverty, not as romantic tragedy, but as exposure of dependency. Isolation, not as emptiness, but as forced reflection. Suffering is not pleasant, it is not beautiful, it is not aesthetic, it is raw, but it is directional. Dostoevsky assumes something radical. Pain is not random, it reveals, it clarifies, it forces a human being to confront the moral reality they tried to escape. Even doubt itself becomes transformative. Ivan's rebellion against God is not shallow atheism, it is existential agony, and even that agony points towards something. In Dostoevsky's universe, you do not suffer because the world is indifferent. You suffer because you are morally situated, because you matter, because your choices echo. Suffering has depth because the universe has structure. It may be tragic, it may be severe, but it is not mechanical. And redemption, crucially, is never erased. No matter how low the descent, no matter how humiliating the collapse, there remains the possibility of return, of confession, of reconciliation, of rebirth. The pattern is clear: breakdown, humility, confession, transformation. This is not optimism. It is costly. It demands endurance, but it offers movement. Pain does not trap you in Dostoevsky. It moves you. It purifies not by soothing, but by burning away illusion. The underlying assumption is profound. The universe is morally structured, and because it is structured, suffering has direction. Meaningful suffering, not because it is desirable, but because it leads somewhere. In Kafka, suffering does not transform, it drains. There is no upward arc, no moral revelation waiting at the bottom, no redemptive moment that makes the pain worthwhile. Joseph K. does not collapse because he has committed sin. He deteriorates because the system never clarifies. His suffering does not refine him, it exhausts him. The trial begins without explanation. It continues without conclusion. He attends hearings that feel improvised. He speaks to officials who know only fragments. He searches for higher authority that remains unreachable. Every effort to understand produces more confusion, and confusion produces compliance. At first, Joseph K. resists. He insists on innocence. He demands clarity. He believes logic will prevail. But logic never arrives. Instead, there are procedures, timetables, corridors, rooms filled with half-informed clerks. The process becomes self-sustaining. It does not need moral justification. It does not seek truth. It only continues. This is mechanical suffering, not tragic, not sacred, just operational. The punishment is not imprisonment, it is depletion. Energy drains slowly, confidence weakens, resistance softens. Not because he is convinced of guilt, but because endless uncertainty erodes him. There is no confession to restore balance, no moment of humility that heals the fracture, because there was no moral fracture to begin with. Only accusation, only implication, only structure. Kafka's suffering reveals something different from Dostoevsky's. It reveals powerlessness, Not moral error, not spiritual corruption, but the individual's inability to penetrate the system surrounding him. The anxiety does not build toward catharsis, it builds toward fatigue. There is no cleansing moment, no spiritual rebirth, only a quiet shrinking, effort without resolution, struggle without transcendence, punishment without crime. The key dynamic is simple: confusion to compliance to depletion. Joseph K. is not purified by his trial. He is worn down by it. And when the end comes, it does not feel redemptive. It feels procedural. He participates in his own execution almost passively, not because he believes he deserves it, but because resistance feels meaningless. In Kafka's world, suffering does not point upward. It exposes limits. It reveals that structure does not require your understanding, or your innocence, or your redemption. The underlying assumption is stark. Pain may not necessarily have direction. It may simply reflect the machinery you are inside. Mechanical suffering, not tragic, not sacred, not purifying, just ongoing. When we put this beside Dostoevsky, the divide becomes sharp. One sees suffering as spiritual movement. The other sees suffering as structural entrapment.
At its core, this is not a disagreement about pain. It is a disagreement about what pain reveals. In Dostoevsky's world, suffering enlarges the interior life. It humiliates first. It breaks certainty. It dismantles pride. But in breaking something, it also opens something. The collapse is not the end of the person. It is the beginning of honesty. Raskolnikov enters suffering as a man convinced of his superiority. He exits suffering aware of his humanity. That shift is everything. Pain does not destroy him. It forces him to confront what he tried to deny: his need for connection, his moral limits, his dependency on grace. Even when suffering is harsh, prison, poverty, exile, it carries direction. It presses the soul inward. It strips away illusion. It reveals that arrogance cannot survive contact with conscience. And conscience in Dostoevsky is not a social invention, it is metaphysical. So endurance becomes meaningful. You do not simply survive pain, you are shaped by it. You descend, but you descend toward truth. Redemption remains possible because moral structure remains intact. The world may wound you, but it does not erase your capacity to rise. Suffering deepens the soul, not gently, but genuinely. Kafka presents a colder landscape. Suffering does not deepen, it clarifies limitation. Joseph K. does not emerge transformed, he emerges diminished. The longer the process continues, the less space he occupies within it. He tries to assert innocence, he tries to reason, he tries to climb the hierarchy. But every attempt meets opacity. The system does not respond to sincerity. It does not respond to humility. It does not respond to endurance. There is no confession that restores alignment, no spiritual moment that reframes the pain. Suffering in Kafka does not reveal moral truth. It reveals structural reality. You are inside something larger than you. Something that does not need to explain itself, something that does not adjust to your moral logic. Endurance here is not upward movement, it is adaptation. The human being shrinks to fit the machinery. The anxiety does not cleanse, it accumulates. The exhaustion does not purify, it drains. There is no visible redemption arc, only procedure reaching its conclusion. And that conclusion feels less like judgment from above and more like inevitability from around. So the real divide becomes this: what does endurance prove? In Dostoevsky, endurance proves the soul has depth. In Kafka, endurance proves the individual has limits. One vision sees pain as tragic but purposeful. The other sees pain as structural and indifferent. One believes suffering can refine. The other suggests suffering simply reveals power imbalance. In one universe, the human being may fall, but can rise through humility. In the other, the human being navigates corridors that never promise ascent. This is not optimism versus pessimism. It is trajectory versus entrapment. Redemptive pain versus procedural suffering. And between those two visions lies a question that still unsettles us. When we endure something difficult, are we being transformed, or are we simply being processed? For Dostoevsky, freedom is not a right, it is a test. Not something granted for comfort, something given at risk. His characters are never fully trapped by circumstance. They are not mechanical products of society. They are not determined by invisible forces. They choose. And that is what makes them tragic. Raskolnikov does not kill because poverty forces him. He kills because he decides to step beyond moral law. He constructs a theory. He persuades himself that greatness requires transgression. He tells himself he is exceptional. Freedom in that moment feels intoxicating, but the act shatters him. Dostoevsky does not portray evil as destiny. He portrays it as misuse of freedom. That is far more unsettling because it means you cannot blame inevitability. You acted. You crossed the line. You were not pushed. You chose. This is where the famous idea emerges. If God does not exist, everything is permitted. It is not a slogan of liberation. It is a warning. Without transcendence, what restrains the will? Without something above the individual, what prevents self-justification? Freedom untethered from moral structure becomes experiment, and experiment easily becomes destruction. Dostoevsky feared not chaos from oppression. He feared chaos from unrestrained autonomy. In The Brothers Karamazov, the Grand Inquisitor delivers a chilling accusation to Christ. He claims humanity cannot bear freedom. People want miracle, mystery, and authority. They want certainty. They want someone to remove the burden of choice. Freedom demands too much. It demands that you answer for yourself, that you cannot hide behind obedience, that you cannot dissolve into the crowd. The Inquisitor suggests that institutions protect humanity from freedom by limiting it, by replacing it with structure, by relieving people of responsibility. But Dostoevsky does not accept that trade. He insists that even if freedom is terrifying, it is real. And conscience proves it. You feel guilt because you could have acted differently. You feel torment because something within you recognizes violation. That recognition is evidence, not of social conditioning, but of moral agency. Freedom, temptation, guilt, accountability. Temptation exists because alternatives exist. Guilt exists because moral order exists. Accountability exists because freedom is real. In Dostoevsky's universe, the battlefield is internal. There is no bureaucracy absorbing blame, no system quietly directing your actions. The struggle is within the soul. And that is what makes it terrifying. You cannot outsource responsibility. You cannot dissolve into procedure. You cannot say, the system made me. You chose, even if your choice was small, even if it was subtle, even if it was silent. Freedom is not loud, it is constant, and that constancy weighs heavily. It means every action matters, every compromise echoes, every act of cruelty fractures something real. But it also means redemption is possible, because if you are free to fall, you are free to rise. Dostoevsky's vision of freedom is not optimistic, it is severe. It gives dignity, but also burden. It affirms autonomy, but demands accountability. Inner moral freedom, dangerous, unavoidable, and impossible to escape without surrendering something essential.
In Kafka's universe, no one declares you unfree. There is no speech announcing the loss of liberty. There are no visible chains, no dramatic overthrow. Joseph K. wakes up in his own bed. He dresses. He goes to work. He speaks normally. From the outside, nothing appears altered. And yet, something fundamental has shifted. He is under arrest, but he is not confined. He is accused, but no accusation is specified. He is allowed to continue his life within boundaries he cannot see. That is the quiet horror. Freedom is not removed, it is reframed. Joseph K. still chooses. He decides whether to attend hearings. He chooses how to respond. He selects which officials to approach. He strategizes. He reasons. But every choice unfolds inside a system already designed. The corridors are pre-built. The rules exist before his awareness of them. He is navigating, not authoring. Kafka introduces a terrifying modern possibility. What if autonomy is partial? What if the structure surrounding you defines the range of possible movement long before you notice? The court in The Trial never fully reveals its laws, yet those laws bind him. There are expectations he does not understand, standards he cannot access, procedures that shape him without explaining themselves. And because there is structure, Joseph K. assumes there must be logic. There must be fairness somewhere above the lower officials. Somewhere at the top, someone must see clearly. But every attempt to ascend only reveals more layers, more clerks, more paperwork, more rooms. Authority is distributed, but never clarified. It does not feel divine. It feels administrative. And administration does not require transcendence. It only requires continuation. Freedom here becomes procedural. You are free to participate, free to comply, free to attend, but not free to question the foundation, not free to demand ultimate clarity. Responsibility still exists, but it floats. Joseph K. feels responsible for defending himself, responsible for navigating the system correctly, responsible for appearing cooperative. But he cannot locate the moral source of that responsibility. There is no crime to repent, no sin to confess, only accusation. Responsibility without clarity becomes psychological erosion. You cannot rebel effectively against something you cannot define. You cannot confess to something you cannot name. So resistance weakens not because you accept guilt, but because the target of resistance dissolves. The movement is subtle but relentless. Attempted autonomy to procedural entanglement, to quiet submission. Not dramatic surrender, gradual accommodation. Fatigue replaces outrage. Compliance replaces confrontation. The system does not crush him violently. It absorbs him slowly. And this absorption is what Kafka fears. Not tyrants, not dictators, but systems that operate independently of moral explanation. Systems that do not need your belief to function. You feel free. You walk through open doors, but every hallway leads to another controlled space. Kafka's imprisonment is not physical, it is structural. Invisible boundaries, invisible hierarchies, invisible rules. You are free, but within parameters you did not design. You are responsible, but without knowing to whom. Dostoevsky feared that humans misuse freedom. Kafka suggests something colder. What if freedom was never as absolute as you believed? What if the machinery defines the edges of your autonomy? Systemic imprisonment. Not chains, not spectacle, just corridors. And corridors rarely lead outside. At the heart of Dostoevsky and Kafka lies a fundamental disagreement. Not about guilt, but where guilt comes from. In Dostoevsky, responsibility originates internally. It begins in the conscience, before society condemns you, before law intervenes, before consequence arrives. There is an inner tribunal. Raskolnikov is not destroyed by the police. He is destroyed by himself. The fracture happens inside. Guilt is not assigned. It erupts. It confirms something terrifying. You had a choice, and you chose. That is why freedom in Dostoevsky is so dangerous, because it is real. You cannot blame fate. You cannot blame structure. You cannot blame invisible forces. Even if the world pressures you, even if poverty surrounds you, even if temptation seduces you, the final act belongs to you. And because it belongs to you, accountability does too. Chaos in this framework does not begin in institutions. It begins when transcendence is denied, when humans claim autonomy without moral structure, when they attempt to stand above good and evil. Responsibility is inward. Moral law is not procedural, it is existential. You are answerable before something higher, even if you rebel against it, even if you doubt it. The guilt itself proves the structure. Freedom, action, guilt, responsibility. It is severe, but it preserves dignity. You are accountable because you are free. Kafka shifts the origin point entirely. In his world, responsibility is assigned externally. You do not begin with a moral decision. You begin with accusation. Joseph K. wakes up already responsible, already implicated, already inside a process he did not initiate. Guilt does not follow action, it precedes it. This changes everything. Freedom feels procedural. You can act, you can speak, you can defend yourself. But the framework is already in place. The system defines the reality you must navigate, not your conscience. Responsibility becomes compliance. You are responsible for attending the hearing, for responding to the summons, for behaving appropriately, but not for a clearly defined moral failure. The system does not ask whether you are righteous, it asks whether you are processed. And that subtle shift transforms accountability. You are not judged by internal conscience, you are evaluated by external procedure. The anxiety is not about sin, it is about position within hierarchy. The system does not require moral coherence, it requires participation. So the individual shrinks, because if responsibility originates outside you, your freedom feels narrower. You cannot confess your way out. You cannot repent your way out. You cannot redeem your way out. The structure does not respond to inner transformation. It responds to protocol. So the conflict becomes precise. Is human failure rooted in moral misuse of freedom, or in systems that shape and confine it? Does guilt prove agency, or does accusation precede choice? In Dostoevsky, you are responsible because you are free. In Kafka, you are responsible because the system says so. Inner moral freedom versus systemic constraint. And depending on which model you believe, you either fight yourself or you navigate corridors. Dostoevsky's characters live inside their own minds. They do not simply act, they dissect, they justify, they rehearse arguments before speaking them. They replay conversations long after they end. They build ideological frameworks to explain their desires. And if we are honest, this feels familiar. The modern individual does not lack thought. They drown in it. Endless self-analysis, constant moral rumination. Was I wrong? Did I offend someone? Am I a good person? Am I complicit? The internal courtroom never closes. Dostoevsky's characters would recognize this condition immediately. Raskolnikov constructs theories to justify murder. Modern individuals construct theories to justify opinions, purchases, affiliations, identities. Every choice feels morally loaded. What you post, what you support, what you remain silent about. Even neutrality becomes a statement. The ideological intensity of our time mirrors Dostoevsky's psychological intensity. People do not simply disagree, they moralize, they categorize, they condemn, they excommunicate. Online debates feel less like discussions and more like trials of character. The argument is rarely about policy, it is about virtue, about who is righteous, about who is corrupted. Cancel culture becomes moral absolutism in public form. Redemption becomes conditional. Forgiveness becomes rare. Confession is demanded, but not always accepted. This is Dostoevskian in spirit, a world where guilt is central, where conscience is amplified, where identity feels morally charged. But unlike Dostoevsky's Russia, our courtroom is digital. The pressure is constant, the audience is endless, and the overthinking never stops. Even in private moments, the mind continues to prosecute itself. You replay your mistakes. You imagine alternative responses. You over-explain your motivations. You construct internal narratives that defend your image. The modern individual often feels responsible for everything: global injustice, political shifts, climate change, social inequality. Silence feels like complicity. Action feels insufficient. The burden becomes heavy, not because someone chained you, but because your conscience feels hyperactive. Modern anxiety, in this sense, resembles moral overconsciousness. Too much awareness, too much responsibility, too much internal scrutiny. You are free, but that freedom feels like obligation. To be informed, to be ethical, to be consistent, to be pure. The result is not clarity, it is exhaustion. Dostoevsky's characters collapse under moral weight. Modern individuals collapse under cognitive weight. The soul becomes crowded, crowded with opinions, with ideological frameworks, with self-monitoring. The overthinking individual, not imprisoned by walls, but by conscience, amplified. Kafka imagined a man trapped inside a system that never fully explained itself. Today, that system does not feel fictional. It feels familiar. You wake up inside structures, platforms, institutions, corporations, portals, dashboards. Everything requires authentication, verification, Authorization. You submit information constantly. Identity numbers, passwords, biometrics, forms. The system recognizes you, but you rarely recognize the system. You apply for a job. An algorithm scans your resume before any human does. You are filtered, but you don't know by what criteria. You receive no rejection, no conversation, just silence. You were not evaluated morally. You were sorted procedurally. You violate a guideline on a social platform. A post disappears. Your account is restricted. You appeal. An automated message thanks you for your patience. No explanation clarifies what you did. There is authority, but no face. The decision happened. The reasoning remains opaque. Kafka's courtrooms have become digital interfaces. The power no longer hides behind dusty clerks. It hides behind code. Algorithms define visibility. They decide what trends, what circulates, what vanishes. Your relevance is quantified. Your behavior is tracked. Your attention becomes data. You participate freely. You scroll voluntarily. You engage willingly, and yet the architecture shapes what you see. Which opinions surface? Which voices amplify? Which ideas disappear? You are not forced. You are guided. This is not dramatic tyranny. It is administrative influence. Corporate structures grow vast. Government systems expand. Decisions affecting millions are made in boardrooms or server rooms, but accountability disperses. No single individual appears responsible. The system decided. The policy requires it. The protocol dictates. Responsibility floats upward and dissolves. You try to resolve a billing issue. You call customer support. You navigate automated menus. You repeat your problem to multiple representatives. Each one apologizes. Each one lacks authority. Each one refers you elsewhere. The system functions, but no one inside it controls the whole. Kafka feared a world where power exists without explanation. We inhabit a world where explanation is optional, and the system continues regardless of understanding. The anxiety this produces is subtle, not moral torment, not existential despair, structural confusion. You are free to submit, free to comply, free to appeal, but the underlying design is not yours. You operate inside corridors of policy, inside frameworks of code, inside hierarchies you did not build. Even success feels procedural. Performance metrics, quarterly evaluations, key performance indicators. You are assessed, measured, ranked, but rarely understood as a whole person. Data replaces dialogue. Compliance replaces conversation. Kafka's nightmare was not loud oppression. It was quiet management, and modern life has perfected that art. The administratively managed individual, not crushed by visible force, but shaped by invisible systems. Not tormented by conscience, but contained by architecture. And unlike Dostoevsky's world, where the struggle is within, here the boundaries are around. Now the file question becomes sharper. Are we overthinking souls or processed citizens? So, which vision feels closer to home? The overthinking soul or the processed citizen? Are we haunted by conscience or surrounded by systems? Dostoevsky's characters collapse under internal weight. They think too much. They moralize everything. They replay decisions endlessly. They feel personally responsible for chaos. That interior pressure feels familiar. Today, self-awareness is constant. We monitor ourselves socially, politically, ethically. We question our motives. We question our privilege. We question our silence. The internal courtroom rarely closes. Social media amplifies it. Opinions are not just preferences, they are moral signals. Positions are not just arguments, they are identity markers. One wrong sentence can feel like moral exposure. The modern individual often feels watched, not only by others, but by their own conscience. We carry invisible ledgers of responsibility: climate change, social injustice, political instability, economic inequality. We feel implicated in systems we barely control. The burden is internalized, and that feels very Dostoevskian. Too much awareness, too much guilt, too much psychological scrutiny. But then there is Kafka's layer. Even if you behave ethically, even if you think carefully, even if you take responsibility, you still operate inside structures that limit you. Algorithms shape visibility. Institutions determine access. Corporate hierarchies define opportunity. Government systems regulate movement. You apply. You submit. You wait. Decisions occur beyond your reach. You are evaluated without being fully known. Sometimes the anxiety is not, "Am I good?" It is, "Am I seen?" Not, "Did I sin?" but "Do I count?" Kafka's world feels less like moral crisis and more like structural fatigue. You are free, but within boundaries. You are responsible, but without clarity. You are visible, but only as data. The guilt feels ambient, not erupting from conscience, but floating in the air of evaluation. Ratings, scores, metrics, reviews. Even without explicit accusation, the sense of being assessed lingers. So which nightmare dominates? The moral overthinker or the bureaucratically contained individual? Perhaps the modern condition is not one or the other. It is both at once. We carry immense internal responsibility and navigate immense external constraint. We feel morally accountable for the world, but structurally limited in shaping it. We analyze ourselves endlessly while adapting quietly to systems we did not design. We fear moral failure, and we fear invisibility. Too much responsibility internally, too little control externally. Dostoevsky would say, "Your suffering proves your freedom." Kafka would say, "Your suffering proves your confinement." And modern life feels like the collision of those two truths. The conscience burns inside, the machinery hums outside, and the individual stands between them, trying to decide which voice is louder: the moral overthinker versus the administratively managed citizen. And perhaps the real question is not which nightmare is ours, but whether we are capable of recognizing both. In Dostoevsky's universe, authority is never neutral. It is never merely administrative. It is rooted in belief. Power does not appear without philosophy behind it. Every structure rests on an idea of what is good, what is true, what is sacred. Authority in this world begins with worldview, with metaphysics, with a claim about ultimate reality. The clearest expression of this is found in The Grand Inquisitor. In that chapter, Christ returns to earth. He performs miracles. The people recognize him, but he is arrested. Not by atheists, not by rebels, but by the church. The Inquisitor confronts him and explains the logic of power. Human beings, he argues, cannot bear freedom. They want miracle, mystery, and authority. They want certainty more than autonomy. So, the church corrected Christ's mistake. It removed unbearable freedom and replaced it with structure. It gave people bread instead of responsibility, security instead of choice, obedience instead of moral burden. This is ideological authority, power justified by moral narrative. It claims to protect, to guide, to save. but it does so by limiting autonomy. In Dostoevsky's framing, tyranny does not emerge from randomness. It emerges from bad philosophy, from distorted belief systems. When ideology claims to know ultimate truth and claims the right to enforce it, control follows naturally. Belief becomes doctrine. Doctrine becomes institution. Institution becomes authority. And authority shapes behavior. Belief, ideology, authority, control. The danger is not power without belief. It is power with absolute belief. When leaders are convinced they possess moral truth, suppression feels justified. Control feels righteous. Opposition feels sinful. Dostoevsky understood this deeply because he lived in a Russia charged with ideological tension. Revolutionaries believed in rational utopia. The church believed in divine order. Each side grounded power in metaphysics, and when metaphysics hardens, authority intensifies. But here's the deeper layer. Even when authority is oppressive, it still explains itself. It offers justification. It claims moral foundation. It argues for necessity. That is what makes it powerful. People surrender freedom not only out of fear, but out of belief. They believe in the narrative. They accept the ideology. They internalize the moral framework. Authority feels legitimate because it tells a story, and that story resonates. Dostoevsky's fear was not authority alone. It was authority detached from humility. Authority convinced of its righteousness. Authority certain that it knows what humanity needs. In this world, power must justify itself morally. Even tyranny speaks the language of salvation. Ideological authority, dangerous not because it lacks belief, but because it believes too completely. In Kafka's world, authority does not announce itself with doctrine. It does not declare ultimate truth. It does not promise salvation. It barely speaks at all. There are courts. There are officials. There are hierarchies stacked upon hierarchies. But no one delivers a grand moral narrative. No one explains what the system ultimately stands for. The authority exists, but it does not justify itself philosophically. It simply functions. Joseph K. does not encounter a tyrant with a manifesto. He encounters procedure, appointments, files, rooms filled with minor clerks. Power here is not charismatic. It is distributed, embedded, layered. No single figure claims absolute truth. No speech outlines ideological necessity. The machinery continues without dramatic declaration. This is bureaucratic authority. It does not ask you to believe. It asks you to participate, to show up, to sign, to respond, to comply. You do not surrender freedom because you are convinced. You surrender it because the procedure is already in motion. The system does not demand loyalty. It demands engagement. And engagement slowly becomes normalization. Procedure, compliance, normalization. At first, Joseph K. resists. He insists on clarity. He demands explanation. But explanation never arrives. Instead, the process continues. Hearings occur whether he understands them or not. Officials act without revealing full authority. The court operates without disclosing its ultimate source. Power embedded in systems, not personalities, not prophets, not ideologues. Bureaucracy sustains itself through repetition, through forms, through ritual, through documentation. Its strength lies in impersonality. No one needs to believe in it passionately. It works because everyone participates minimally. This is what makes Kafka's authority unsettling. It does not need you to convince you morally. It only needs you to function within it. And most people do, because resistance requires clarity, and clarity is withheld. There is no dramatic villain, no speech exposing evil, only corridors, only offices, only silent continuation. Power becomes structural, invisible, self-sustaining. It does not collapse when belief fades, because it never depended on belief. It depended on procedure. The underlying assumption is stark. Authority does not require moral foundation. It requires participation. You comply because the process expects you to. You adapt because it is easier than resisting something you cannot fully see. In this universe, tyranny does not arise from ideology. It emerges from accumulation, from layers of regulation, from systems that continue operating long after their purpose becomes unclear. Bureaucratic authority, quiet, faceless, persistent.
There are two very different kinds of authority in these worlds. One speaks loudly. The other barely speaks at all. In Dostoevsky's universe, authority explains itself. It argues. It persuades. It justifies. It tells you why it must exist. Tyranny emerges not from silence, but from conviction. Someone believes they understand human nature. Someone believes they know what saves the soul. Someone believes they possess moral truth. And from that belief, control becomes righteous. The Grand Inquisitor does not hide his logic. He explains it clearly. People are weak. Freedom is unbearable. Certainty must replace it. Control is an act of mercy. Authority becomes paternal, protective, even compassionate in tone. People surrender freedom not only because they are forced, but because they want certainty. They want relief from responsibility. They accept control because it promises meaning. This is ideological domination. It believes too much. It believes so deeply in its own philosophy that suppression feels necessary. Now compare that with Kafka's world. Authority rarely explains itself. There is no grand speech, no philosophical defense, no moral crusade. Power functions without narrative. Rules exist, procedures exist, but their ultimate justification remains unclear. Control is not framed as salvation. It is framed as protocol. The system does not promise certainty. It demands compliance. You surrender autonomy not because you are convinced, but because you are exhausted. You comply because the paperwork continues, because the process drags on, because resistance feels futile against something faceless. This is administrative domination. It believes nothing at all, or at least it does not need belief. It runs on repetition, on procedure, on participation. So which is more dangerous? Authority that believes too much, or authority that believes nothing? Ideological control shapes the soul. It captures conviction. It inspires loyalty and repression alike. Administrative control shapes behavior. It captures routine. It normalizes submission. It reduces resistance through complexity. One dominates through meaning. The other dominates through structure. One says, "Trust me, I know what is right." The other says nothing and continues anyway. One demands surrender for salvation.
The other absorbs surrender through fatigue. And perhaps the modern world contains both. Ideologies still exist, but systems have grown vast. We are persuaded by narratives and processed by procedures. So the final tension remains. Is authority most dangerous when it is certain or when it is indifferent? Ideological control versus administrative control. And somewhere between belief and bureaucracy, we live. In Dostoevsky's world, absurdity does not creep in, it explodes. It does not arrive as mood, it arrives as crisis. The line often associated with him, "If God does not exist, everything is permitted," is not a slogan of rebellion, it is a warning flare. It suggests that morality is not automatic, that without transcendence, ethical structure loses gravity. For Dostoevsky, God is not merely a belief, God is the anchor point of responsibility. Remove that anchor and human freedom becomes terrifying, because now nothing stands above you, no ultimate judge, no eternal reference point, no sacred boundary you did not invent. You are free, completely free, and that freedom becomes vertigo. Raskolnikov does not murder out of impulse, he murders out of theory. He constructs an argument, he convinces himself that extraordinary individuals are permitted to transgress, that moral law applies to the ordinary, not the exceptional. He treats ethics as an intellectual experiment. The act is deliberate, rational, cold. But what follows is not triumph, it is collapse. His body rebels, his mind fractures, fever grips him, isolation intensifies, conscience refuses to be silenced. The punishment is not the police, it is internal implosion. This is what Dostoevsky is revealing. When transcendence collapses, morality does not disappear peacefully, it convulses. Freedom without higher structure does not feel empowering, it feels unbearable. Because you now author your own law, and you must live with it. Ivan Karamazov embodies the philosophical version of this explosion. He rejects divine order because he cannot reconcile innocent suffering. He returns the ticket to a universe that permits cruelty. He refuses cosmic harmony purchased at the cost of children's tears. His rebellion is moral, it is compassionate, but it is unstable. Because once God is rejected, the moral framework trembles. If there is no final justice, if there is no ultimate reconciliation, then what holds ethics in place? Dostoevsky does not present atheism as evil, he presents it as volatile. It creates a vacuum, and vacuum produces pressure. Absurdity in this context is not quiet meaninglessness, it is a moral emergency, a rupture, a spiritual earthquake. The individual suddenly stands alone before the infinite, no script, no guarantee, no segment metaphysical insurance. Loss of God, moral vertigo, crisis of responsibility. The absurd is experienced as shock, as confrontation, as a moment that demands decision. Do you rebuild meaning through faith? Do you attempt to create morality from within? Do you surrender to chaos? Do you confess? Do you break? Dostoevsky's characters cannot live neutrally in absurdity. They either revolt violently against moral law or collapse under its absence. Absurdity is dramatic because morality still matters deeply. The soul still burns. Conscience still speaks. Even in rebellion, the moral structure haunts them. And that is the paradox. Even when God is denied, the need for moral order does not vanish. It intensifies. This is why absurdity feels explosive, because the human being is not prepared to live without moral gravity.
Remove transcendence, and freedom expands beyond comfort. Absurdity becomes existential shock, not boredom, not apathy, but crisis. The kind that fractures minds, the kind that forces confession, the kind that demands a decision. In Kafka's world, absurdity does not arrive like a storm. It arrives like weather, unremarkable, persistent. There is no moment where meaning collapses publicly, no declaration that the heavens are empty, no philosophical argument that dismantles God. There is simply a man who wakes up, accused. No explanation, no drama, just procedure beginning. The absence of meaning is never announced, it is assumed. The court exists, the officials exist, the hierarchy exists, but its ultimate foundation remains inaccessible. This is not moral chaos, it is structural continuation. The system functions perfectly well without metaphysical grounding. Files are processed, summons are delivered, rooms are prepared, hearings occur. No one pauses to justify the court's authority. No one offers a final explanation of its origin. Power does not persuade, it operates. In Dostoevsky, absurdity creates existential panic. In Kafka, absurdity creates confusion. But confusion quickly becomes adjustment. Joseph K. begins with protest. He demands clarity. He insists on fairness. He believes explanation must exist somewhere. But each attempt to reach the center leads only to another layer, another office, another minor official, another vague answer. And slowly, resistance weakens. Confusion to adaptation to continuation. He continues showing up, continues participating, continues navigating the system. Absurdity does not inspire rebellion, it produces fatigue. There is no grand revolt against heaven, there is no dramatic renunciation of morality. Life continues, which is precisely the horror, because nothing feels catastrophic enough to justify collapse. The world still runs, work still happens, schedules are kept, people eat, people sleep, people wait. Meaning is absent, but functionality remains. This is absurdity as atmosphere, not an event, not a rupture, a background condition. In Kafka's universe, authority does not need moral defense. It does not claim divine sanction. It does not proclaim righteousness. It simply proceeds. And because it proceeds, individuals adapt. They adjust expectations. They lower demands. They normalize ambiguity. They begin to live inside unanswered questions. The silence here is not sacred mystery. It is opacity. Not transcendence, but distance. Not divine testing, but administrative layering. The characters rarely explode emotionally. They rarely denounce the entire structure. Instead, they grow smaller within it. They comply incrementally. They seek minor approvals. They navigate corridors of power with quiet resignation. Absurdity becomes embedded in routine, a file misplaced, a summons unclear, a decision unexplained. No ultimate answer arrives, but neither does total breakdown. And that is Kafka's deeper insight. Meaning does not need to collapse dramatically. It can fade while life continues normally. The system does not require belief, it requires participation. And participation continues even when understanding does not. Absurdity becomes environmental, like air pressure, like background noise. You adjust to it without noticing how much it shapes you. No explosion, no rebellion, just continuation. Absurdity as condition. Absurdity as climate. Absurdity as the quiet void you wake up inside. There are two ways the absurd can enter a life, like a collapse, or like weather. For Dostoevsky,
Absurdity is rupture. It is not subtle. It is not gradual. It is experienced as shock. The moment when transcendence is questioned. The moment when moral order feels unstable. The moment when freedom becomes terrifying. His characters do not drift into meaninglessness. They slam into it. The collapse of God is not theoretical. It destabilizes action. If there is no divine foundation, if there is no ultimate justice, if there is no eternal reference point, then responsibility becomes infinite and unbearable. This is why absurdity creates moral emergency in Dostoevsky. It forces confrontation. You cannot remain neutral. You must respond. Faith, rebellion, repentance, madness, but not indifference. The absurd here is explosive because conscience still burns intensely. The moral framework has cracked, but it still matters. When meaning collapses, it hurts. It creates fever. It fractures the psyche. It produces confession or destruction. Absurdity is something that happens to you. It interrupts your life. It demands a decision. It destabilizes the soul. Now shift to Kafka. In Kafka's universe, absurdity does not interrupt anything. There is no moment of collapse, no grand realization, no dramatic loss. The system is already running. The court already exists. The hierarchy is already layered. You do not experience a rupture. You experience confusion, and then you adapt. Absurdity is not crisis. It is condition. You wake up inside it. There is no explosion because there was no clear structure to collapse. There is no transcendence loudly dying. There is simply opacity. Authority without explanation. Procedure without ultimate reason. Meaning not shattered, just never fully provided. In this world, absurdity requires no dramatic response. There is no call to heroic rebellion, no theological reckoning, no confession scene. There is paperwork. There are corridors. There is waiting. You are not forced into existential decision. You are absorbed into continuation. The absurd becomes atmospheric, a background pressure. You adjust, you comply, you proceed, not because you accept it philosophically, but because it never escalates into something dramatic enough to revolt against. So the contrast becomes sharper. Dostoevsky's absurdity is crisis. Kafka's absurdity is climate. One feels like a fire alarm. The other feels like low oxygen. One shakes you awake. The other keeps you half awake. In one, you are thrown into moral vertigo. In the other, you slowly normalize disorientation. And here is the deeper philosophical tension. Is absurdity an event that fractures belief or a condition of modern existence that no longer feels exceptional? Does it explode or hum? Does it demand a response or quietly erode clarity over time? Dostoevsky assumes absurdity creates confrontation. Kafka assumes absurdity requires no announcement. One forces you to choose. The other makes choice feel marginal. Absurdity as crisis. Absurdity as condition. And perhaps the most unsettling realization is this: we may experience both. Moments of spiritual rupture, moments where meaning collapses dramatically, and long stretches where life continues inside systems that never explain themselves. The fire and the machinery, the emergency and the environment, the moral explosion and the quiet void. And somewhere between them stands the modern individual, trying to decide whether something broke or whether this was always how it was. In Dostoevsky's universe, hope is not optimism. It is not positivity. It is not psychological comfort. It is structural. It is built into the moral fabric of reality itself. When a character falls, they do not fall into randomness. They fall into consequence. And consequence in this world has direction. Raskolnikov does not simply commit murder. He commits it with theory, with justification, with intellectual arrogance. He tries to step outside moral law. He tests whether morality applies universally or selectively. He acts as if transcendence can be bypassed. And when he acts, something deeper responds, not immediately through police, but through conscience, through internal fracture, through psychological disintegration. His suffering is not accidental, it is proportional. It reveals something. It exposes the illusion that one can exist beyond moral gravity. This is what makes hope architectural in Dostoevsky. The collapse is not meaningless, it is diagnostic. The pain points somewhere. Suffering becomes movement. It strips pride. It dismantles ego. It confronts self-deception. But it does not annihilate the person. It prepares them. Confession in this structure is not humiliation. It is restoration. It is alignment. It is the moment when inner truth and outer reality reconnect. The prison sentence is not presented as mere punishment. It becomes purification. Not in a simplistic sense, but in a spiritual one. The soul bends, but it does not break permanently. This is the deeper metaphysical assumption. The universe contains moral gravity. Actions carry weight. Guilt signals something real. And because moral law is real, redemption is possible. You cannot escape consequence, but you are not abandoned within it. That is the architecture. Transgression, suffering, humility, redemption. Even rebellion contains the possibility of return. Ivan Karamazov's rejection of God is not dismissed lightly. His arguments are serious. His moral outrage is profound. But even in doubt, the structure of meaning remains present. The struggle itself implies depth. The conflict implies structure. The very intensity of moral crisis suggests that morality is not an illusion. Dostoevsky's characters often descend to extremes, but descent is not terminal, it is transitional. Fall does not equal finality. That is the crucial difference between tragedy and annihilation. In this world, failure is not the end of narrative. It is the beginning of transformation. Hope is not something characters invent to cope. It is something reality permits. It is possible because the world itself is morally ordered. Even when God feels hidden, even when faith trembles, even when doubt grows loud, the possibility of return remains. That is why suffering leads somewhere. That is why redemption arc exists. That is why collapse does not equal erasure. Hope is not suspended in midair. It rests on foundation. And that foundation is moral structure. Hope with architecture. Not emotional reassurance, but metaphysical confidence that the story can turn.
In Kafka's world, hope is not erased, it is displaced. It exists, but it never quite reaches you. There are moments in the trial that suggest resolution might come, a higher authority, a clearer explanation, a final hearing that clarifies everything. The structure implies meaning. It implies hierarchy. It implies that somewhere, someone understands the system completely. But that clarity never descends. It remains at a distance. The possibility of resolution hovers, but it does not land. This is what makes Kafka's version of hope unsettling. It is not destroyed, it is postponed. Joseph K. does not begin in despair. He begins with expectation. He assumes explanation must exist. He assumes innocence can be demonstrated. He assumes the system ultimately makes sense. Each stage reinforces that assumption. Another hearing, another official,
another procedural step. Each moment implies progress, but progress never resolves into conclusion. Expectation, delay, ambiguity, continuation. The movement continues. The arrival never occurs. The structure suggests hierarchy, but the top is unreachable. The authority implies justification, but it never reveals it. The court exists, but its foundation remains inaccessible. This creates a specific psychological tension, not explosive despair, not moral crisis, but suspended anticipation. You wait, you prepare, you comply, you hope, and clarity recedes. Endings in Kafka do not resolve, they conclude without closure. Not tragic in a theatrical sense, not redemptive, not even dramatically catastrophic. They simply stop, as if the process ended, but the meaning never arrived. Kafka once wrote, "There is hope, infinite hope, but not for us." This line captures the tone precisely. Hope is not denied absolutely. It is abstract, conceptual, perhaps even infinite in theory, but inaccessible in practice. It belongs somewhere else, to someone else, to a level of authority you cannot reach. This is hope at a distance. It does not anchor the narrative. It does not guarantee renewal. It does not structure suffering. It exists as implication, not as fulfillment. Movement without arrival, procedure without verdict, structure without reassurance. The underlying assumption is stark. Hope may exist, but it is not promised to the individual. You can move within the system, you can seek answers, you can follow every step, but the system does not owe you resolution, and so hope becomes deferred, not shattered, not extinguished, just perpetually postponed. This is colder than despair, because despair at least acknowledges finality. Kafka offers something quieter, unresolved continuation. Life goes on. The process continues. Hope hovers somewhere above, but does not descend. Deferred hope, not impossible, just unreachable. At its deepest level, this is not a literary disagreement. It is a metaphysical divide. Two fundamentally different assumptions about how reality works. For Dostoevsky, hope is not an emotion. It is architecture. It is embedded into the structure of the moral universe. Even when God feels distant, even when doubt is overwhelming, even when rebellion burns fiercely, the structure remains intact. Judgment is not annihilation, it is reckoning, and reckoning leads somewhere. When Raskolnikov confesses, the world does not collapse around him, it realigns. When a character suffers, the suffering is not pointless. It carries moral direction. It exposes pride. It strips illusion. It forces humility. But it does not erase the person. The fall is real, but it is not final. This is what it means for hope to be designed. It is woven into consequence itself. Because the universe contains moral gravity, restoration remains possible. Because judgment is meaningful, renewal is imaginable. Even when the journey is painful, even when redemption is slow, the arc is there. Transgression does not end the narrative, it deepens it. The assumption beneath all this is profound. Reality is morally structured, and therefore, collapse can turn into return. Hope does not hover above existence, it is built into it. Now shift to Kafka. Here, the architecture dissolves, not dramatically, quietly. Judgment exists, but does not clarify. Authority exists, but does not redeem. Procedure exists, but does not restore. Hope is not denied outright, but it is not delivered. The system suggests hierarchy. It suggests a higher explanation. It suggests ultimate order, but it never reveals it. Suffering does not move toward transformation. It exposes limits. It shows how small the individual is within vast structures. There is no visible arc from failure to renewal. There is only process and continuation. Hope in Kafka's universe is abstract. It may exist in theory, somewhere beyond reach, somewhere at a level of authority you cannot access, but it is not guaranteed to enter your life. It remains suspended. This creates a colder tension than despair, because despair at least closes the door. Kafka leaves it half open. There might be hope, but it is not for you. And so the contrast becomes philosophical rather than narrative. Dostoevsky assumes design. Kafka assumes opacity. Dostoevsky trusts that moral gravity implies restoration. Kafka questions whether gravity leads anywhere at all. In one world, suffering has trajectory. In the other, suffering reveals containment. In one world, judgment purifies. In the other, judgment exhausts. In one world, hope is structural. In the other, hope is deferred indefinitely. And beneath this contrast lies the central question. Is hope woven into the fabric of reality, or is it something human beings project into uncertainty because we cannot endure its absence? Does redemption exist because the universe is morally structured, or because we need a narrative that promises return? Structured redemption, suspended expectation. One offers direction, the other offers ambiguity. And perhaps what makes this comparison so powerful is that both feel true in different moments of life. Sometimes suffering feels transformative. Sometimes it feels procedural. Sometimes judgment restores. Sometimes it simply lingers. The question is not only which philosopher was right, it is which architecture we find ourselves living inside, and whether hope is foundation or horizon. In Crime and Punishment, the real trial begins long before the state notices anything. There are no judges present, no prosecutors, no jury, and yet the proceedings are already underway. Dostoevsky relocates the courtroom from society into the soul. Raskolnikov commits murder with theory behind it. He convinces himself that morality is conditional, that extraordinary individuals have the right to step over ordinary laws. He imagines that reason can replace moral structure, that intellect can authorize transgression. The crime is deliberate, calculated, philosophical. But what follows is not freedom, it is fragmentation. Almost immediately, the internal machinery activates. He cannot sleep. He cannot think clearly. He withdraws. His body burns with fever. His mind loops through suspicion and paranoia. He is not arrested, but he is not free. This is the inner court, and it functions without summons. Dostoevsky suggests that moral law is not invented by society. It precedes it. Human law may fail. Courts may never discover the crime. Evidence may never surface. But conscience does not require paperwork. It does not require witness testimony. It does not require procedural validation. It simply reacts. This reaction is not psychological weakness. It is metaphysical consequence. Because in Dostoevsky's world, justice reflects moral reality. It is not arbitrary. It is not social construction alone. It corresponds to something deeper, something structured into existence itself. The suffering Raskolnikov experiences is not random anxiety. It is collision. His theory crashes against moral gravity. He tried to live beyond good and evil, but good and evil assert themselves internally. The universe does not remain neutral. Even when God is not visibly intervening, divine order is implied. Moral law operates quietly, but forcefully. And so the crime produces an inner trial. Interrogation happens through conscience. Cross-examination happens through self-doubt. Sentencing happens through isolation. And the punishment is not merely prison. It is unbearable dissonance. This is why confession becomes pivotal. Confession is not surrender to authority. It is surrender to truth. It restores coherence between action and reality. It acknowledges the structure that was violated. Crime, guilt, inner trial, confession, restoration. The prison sentence that follows is secondary. The true sentence was psychological fracture, and the true liberation begins with alignment. In Dostoevsky's moral universe, judgment is not simply consequence. It is revelation. It clarifies what is real. It realigns what was fractured. It purifies what was corrupted. This is justice as metaphysical, not merely institutional, not merely procedural, but embedded in the structure of being itself. The courtroom is the soul. The verdict is unavoidable, and strangely, merciful. Because in Dostoevsky's world, even judgment leaves room for redemption. In the trial, judgment does not begin with crime. It begins with accusation. Joseph K. wakes up one morning and is informed he is under arrest. No explanation, no defined charge, no visible crime. And yet, the process has already started. This is Kafka's crucial inversion. In Dostoevsky, crime precedes judgment. In Kafka, judgment precedes crime. The court exists independently of wrongdoing. The machinery does not wait for moral failure. It functions as if guilt is assumed. The court in the trial is not chaotic. It is structured. There are officials. There are hearings. There are offices hidden in attics. There are files and procedures and layers of authority. But clarity never arrives. Each attempt to reach the center reveals another layer, another intermediary, another deferral. Authority is everywhere, but nowhere fully accessible. This is not a moral reckoning. It is perpetual procedure. Accusation, bureaucracy, delay, exhaustion, and unresolved end. There is movement, but not resolution. There are hearings, but not verdicts. There are conversations, but not answers. The system implies order, but it withholds meaning. Joseph K. seeks justification. He seeks explanation. He assumes the law must correspond to something rational, something moral, something coherent. But the court never confirms this. It does not defend itself philosophically. It does not claim divine mandate. It does not argue moral necessity. It simply continues. That is what makes it powerful. The law in Kafka's universe does not require moral grounding. It does not need transcendence. It does not need divine order. It does not need ethical coherence. It requires participation. The process sustains itself. Clerks follow procedure. Officials conduct hearings. Papers are filed. Rooms are occupied. The machinery runs whether or not justice exists. This is judgment without revelation, without purification, without restoration. There is no confession that resolves tension, no inner clarity that restores order, no moral realignment. The ending does not clarify the crime. It does not restore innocence. It even does not confirm guilt in a meaningful way. It simply concludes, quietly, as if the process reached its limit, not its truth. In this world, judgment is not moral truth pressing inward. It is structure pressing outward. It exhausts rather than purifies. It disorients rather than reveals. It contains rather than redeem. The terrifying implication is this: law can exist without justice. Authority can operate without moral foundation. Judgment can continue without clarity. The system does not collapse because meaning is missing. It adapts. It persists. It absorbs individuals into its mechanisms. Process becomes power, not because it convinces, but because it continues. And when judgment becomes endless procedure, resolution is no longer the goal. Continuation is. Strip away the characters for a moment. Forget the plots. What remains is a question about power, about judgment, about whether law reveals truth or simply operates. Dostoevsky and Kafka are not just telling stories about courts. They are proposing two entirely different blueprints for reality. In Dostoevsky's universe, law is not invented. It is discovered. It exists before institutions formalize it. The state may punish, but the state does not originate justice. Justice precedes it. When Raskolnikov feels guilt, it is not because society has conditioned him. It is because he has collided with moral gravity. He stepped outside an order that exists independently of him. The suffering that follows is not mechanical consequence. It is revelation. Judgment in this world clarifies. It exposes the fracture between action and truth. It burns, but it burns toward something. Punishment is not designed to exhaust. It is designed to realign. The prison sentence is not merely confinement. It is purification. Guilt is meaningful because it corresponds to something real. The inner court and the outer court eventually converge. Resolution becomes possible because law reflects moral truth. There is an endpoint. There is a reckoning. There is the possibility of renewal. Justice, even when harsh, reveals structure. Now shift to Kafka. Here, law does not feel discovered. It feels constructed, layered, administrative. The court in the trial does not expose moral fracture. It manages. It processes. It continues. Guilt does not arise from violation. It arrives first. Explanation may never follow. Joseph K. is accused without defined crime. Judgment is procedural, not metaphysical. The law does not purify. It exhausts. It absorbs the individual into endless steps, meetings, rooms, clerks, deferrals. There is structure, but not moral revelation. There is authority, but not ultimate truth. The system does not collapse when meaning is unclear. It adapts. It sustains itself. Resolution is not the goal. Continuation is. This is the deeper philosophical split. In Dostoevsky's world, law expresses moral order. In Kafka's world, law expresses institutional survival. One assumes that justice corresponds to truth. The other suggests that judgment can function independently of it. One purifies through confrontation. The other contains through repetition. One ends in reckoning. The other ends in exhaustion. And so the core conflict sharpens. Is law an expression of moral truth, or a mechanism that sustains itself regardless of truth? When we encounter judgment today, does it clarify who we are, or does it manage us? Does it aim to restore order, or simply preserve procedure? justice as revelation, process as continuation. Between these two models lies not just literary contrast, but a question about the world we inhabit. And the uncomfortable possibility is this: we may long for justice, but increasingly experience machinery.
After everything, guilt, God, suffering, law, hope, the comparison narrows to something disturbingly simple. Which nightmare feels familiar? When you wake up anxious, is it because you did something wrong, or because you don't understand the system you're inside? Dostoevsky feared moral collapse. He feared what would happen when transcendence eroded and individuals carried unbearable freedom. His characters overthink. They justify. They obsess. They spiral inward. They feel guilty, sometimes before anyone accuses them. And look around today. We live in a culture of moral exposure. Every statement recorded, every opinion archived, every mistake screenshotted. People analyze their own intentions publicly. They apologize. They confess. They defend. They collapse under internal pressure. We fear saying the wrong thing. We rehearse conversations in our heads. We replay decisions at night. We carry ideological weight constantly. Moral anxiety has not disappeared. If anything, it has intensified. We judge ourselves and each other relentlessly. Dostoevsky would recognize this. He would recognize the fever, the self-accusation, the internal courtroom that never rests. But that is only half the story, because at the same time, something else is happening, something quieter. Kafka's world has grown. Algorithms decide visibility. Institutions respond with automated emails. Appeals are processed, not heard. Decisions are made according to policy. You apply for a job and hear nothing. You are banned from a platform and receive no explanation. You file a complaint and enter a system of tickets and numbers. You speak to no one. You face no villain. There is no moral speech explaining why. Only procedure. Only continuation. And slowly, you stop asking for clarity. You adapt. You comply. You continue. Kafka would recognize this too. The faceless authority, the layered hierarchy, the sense of being judged without ever meeting the judge, the feeling that explanation exists somewhere, but not for you. So which one understood us better? Are we morally collapsing or administratively processed? Are we guilty or managed? Some days it feels like we are drowning in conscience, overthinking every action, carrying ideological weight we barely understand. Other days it feels like we are simply moving through systems too large to confront, submitting to procedures that never justify themselves. Maybe the deeper truth is uncomfortable. We live in both worlds. Internally, we are Dostoevsky's characters, overburdened with responsibility, haunted by moral language, obsessed with intention. Externally, we are Kafka's characters, navigating structures we did not build, subject to judgments we do not understand, contained by machinery that does not need our belief to operate. Dostoevsky predicted the crisis of the soul. Kafka predicted the crisis of structure. Modern life may be their intersection. We feel guilty even when no one accuses us, and we feel accused even when we have done nothing. We seek redemption and receive automated replies.
We confess and still remain inside systems that do not transform. So who understood the modern world better? Perhaps neither, or perhaps both, because the anxiety of our time is double: moral overexposure, structural opacity. The conscience burns, the machinery hums, and we stand between them, trying to decide whether we need forgiveness or explanation. What if we've been asking the wrong question? Not who was right, but what if they were both describing different layers of the same human condition? Dostoevsky looked inward. Kafka looked outward. One stared into the conscience, the other stared into the structure. And modern life seems to require both lenses at once. Inside, we are overburdened. We analyze our motives. We replay conversations. We fear moral failure. We worry about being wrong, ethically, politically, personally. We feel responsible for everything, for injustice, for suffering, for the state of the world. The internal courtroom never closes. The judge is conscience. The verdict is anxiety. Dostoevsky explains this. He understood what happens when moral responsibility expands beyond comfort, when freedom becomes weight, when guilt becomes atmosphere. But step outside the mind, open your laptop, apply for a job, read the policy, submit the form. Wait. The response is automated. The decision is algorithmic. The system functions regardless of your moral clarity. You can be sincere. You can confess. You can apologize. You can grow. The structure does not transform with you. Kafka explains this. He understood what it means to live inside systems that do not respond to moral effort, where judgment is procedural, where clarity is deferred, where explanation is optional. So what are we? Morally collapsing souls or administratively contained citizens? The uncomfortable answer is both. We are internally Dostoevskian, externally Kafkaesque. We carry too much responsibility in a world that gives us too little control. We are told we are free, but our choices are shaped by invisible architectures. We are told we are accountable, but many outcomes are structural. We confess our flaws, but the machinery continues. This creates a unique modern tension: guilt without power, responsibility without leverage, conscience without authority, systems without explanation. Dostoevsky explains why we feel morally anxious. Kafka explains why we feel structurally trapped. And when these two conditions overlap, something strange happens. We begin to blame ourselves for what systems produce. We internalize structural limitations. We treat bureaucratic opacity as personal failure. We confuse algorithmic judgment with moral judgment. We ask, "What did I do wrong?" when sometimes the answer is, you entered a system that does not reveal its logic. And yet, we also cannot fully escape responsibility, because moral agency still exists. We still choose. We still harm. We still justify. We still repent. So reconciliation does not mean blending them into one theory. It means recognizing two dimensions of modern life: the inner battlefield and the outer machinery, the soul struggling with meaning, the structure functioning without it. To reconcile them is not to soften them. It is to admit that the modern individual lives in tension, morally overburdened, structurally constrained, free in theory, managed in practice. And perhaps wisdom today is not choosing one philosopher over the other, but learning to distinguish when your anxiety is moral and when it is structural, when you need repentance and when you need clarity, when you are guilty and when you are simply processed. That is the synthesis, not a solution, but awareness. Dostoevsky for the conscience, Kafka for the system, and modern life standing in the space between them. After all of this, after guilt, God, suffering, law, absurdity, authority, what remains is not a verdict. It's a question. What do we do with guilt now? If Dostoevsky was right, guilt is a signal. It tells us we have crossed something real. It burns because conscience still matters. But if Kafka was right, sometimes the weight we feel is not moral failure. It is structural pressure. It is being inside systems that do not explain themselves. So when you feel judged, who is judging you? Your conscience? Or an invisible process? Are you seeking forgiveness or clarity? And hope. What does hope mean now? Is it redemption? A return? A transformation after suffering? Or is it something more fragile? A small act of defiance in a world that does not promise resolution? Do we still believe suffering leads somewhere? Or have we begun to accept continuation without direction? Perhaps hope today is quieter, less architectural, less guaranteed, more chosen. What kind of freedom do we actually have? Dostoevsky would say, you are radically free, terrifyingly responsible. Your choices define you. Kafka would say, you feel free, but within corridors, within structures you did not build, within procedures that continue whether you understand them or not. So where does that leave us? Maybe freedom now is partial, moral inside, limited outside. Maybe we are free in intention, but constrained in outcome. Maybe the modern condition is this: we carry infinite responsibility in a finite system. We confess our flaws while navigating algorithms. We seek redemption while filling out forms. We worry about being good while being processed. And the question is no longer who was right, but how do we live knowing both are true? Maybe the answer is not heroic. Maybe it is simply awareness. Knowing when guilt is real, knowing when judgment is mechanical, knowing when to repent, knowing when to resist, knowing when to accept that the machine will not explain itself. There may be no final reconciliation, no grand synthesis, no verdict that closes the case. Only this: the soul still asks questions, the system still runs, and we are somewhere between conscience and machinery, still choosing, still waiting, still trying to understand whether we need forgiveness or transparency. No resolution, just recognition. And perhaps that is enough. And that's it for today, my friend. You were listening to Wise Alchemy. The story ends here for now, but you and I, we'll meet again. Thank you.